everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Dean Smith, the director of Cornell University Press, and this is the first time we're together to celebrate our 150th anniversary, of the press. And I wanted it to be here because A.D. White was instrumental in founding the press. He wanted the press to serve as an intellectual organ and to diffuse knowledge as widely as possible. And the great thing is that now we can do that. We have ebooks, we have ways to getting our content into 250 countries, depending on what our access model is. And so today we're going to talk about university presses in the age of reliable knowledge and the importance of university presses. And I've been thinking independently how important university presses are at this time in terms of peer review, in terms of being able to publish truthful scholarship. And last night we had an event for Tom Jones at Literature Hall, and the person the Pulitzer Prize winning photographer who was there and took this photo, he was there. He's now went from being a photographer to being a Franciscan monk. And was there in his Franciscan garb last night, and he turned to me and he said, "Remember when we used to be concerned with the sound of one tree falling in the forest? Now, how do we sift through all of the noise of all the trees falling at the same time?" And I think that actually was a really good way to kind of launch this panel. I've talked about this with Gerald, and we have many meetings together. Gerald Beasley is fantastic, and he's my boss, and it's not just because he's my boss that I say that. But our meetings last an hour and a half, 2 hours, and with Gerald it's like 6 o'clock, we gotta go home. But Gerald really helped frame this as being about reliable knowledge, and Gerald suggested that the Dean of Faculty, Charlie Van Loan, come and introduce the panelists. So with that, I will introduce Charlie, and I hope you enjoy this evening. Thank you.
So if you read some of the literature, there's a connection to a Senate Resolution 127, which is entitled Cornell Leadership and Honesty and Reliable Knowledge. And that's the most shocking of all the Senate resolutions in my mind for two reasons. First, who would ever have thought that you'd need a resolution like that? And then second, it was actually mentioned in Martha's inauguration speech. So that's the first time anyone has ever mentioned the Senate in an inauguration, I assume. And it's kind of surprising given how people sometimes think about the Senate. So we have 5 great speakers, and let me just say a few words about each of them in left to right order. So Mahinder Kingra is the editor-in-chief currently of the press. He's been at the press since 2004, and before that at Johns Hopkins. Some of the things he'll talk about will be peer review, selectiveness of tenure evaluations and so on, which is really important in my line of work right now, and trends in the roles of university presses. Durba Ghosh is a professor in history, and she specializes in colonial India, and her most recent book is Gentlemanly Terrorists, Political Violence and the Colonial State in India, 1919 to 47. So we all know that public trust in universities is threatened and on the decline, and it's happening in India, and she'll give us reasons for that, different from what's happening here, but I'm sure there are interesting connections, and the huge role that 2 university presses play over there, which is Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press. Peter Enns is a professor in government. He's also the director of the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research. His latest book is on Incarceration Nation, and it explains why we have such a huge prison population in this country. Some of the things he'll tell us about are books versus journals, and that connects to timelines to publications, which is of course extremely important for faculty. Noliwe Rooks is a professor in Africana Studies and in Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Her most recent book is Cutting School, Privatization, Segregation, and the End of Public Education. One of the things she'll talk about is reliable versus usable knowledge, and that's kind of interesting to me because I'm a STEM guy, I'm from engineering. For us, reliability and usability are one and the same. So I'm interested in the versus in your presentation. Brewster Kahle studied artificial intelligence at MIT, joined Thinking Machines back in the mid-'80s, and I have actually a connection to that. They developed something called the connection machine, which was one of the first parallel supercomputers. I've done work in that sort of area back then and throughout my career. He's a founder of the Internet Archive. It's a digital library that embodies his view of universal access to all knowledge. And we're interested in hearing his view on that very topic. Okay, so the plan is that each of you talk for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have questions.
Great, all right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And thank you for helping us celebrate our 150th anniversary. So I'm going to be talking about peer review and its role in reliable knowledge. And I'm going to begin with an anecdote. This is on the morning of November 9th, 2016. I flew down to Washington, D.C. to participate in a task force on rebranding the American Association of University Presses, which is our umbrella organization, and it represents the interests of more than 140 scholarly publishers around the world. I'd gone to bed early the night before and only heard the news, shocking, about the presidential election results as I was driving up to the airport in Syracuse. And though accusations of fake news had already been deployed by the Trump campaign against journalists who presented facts that candidate Trump didn't like, I had no idea, and I don't think anyone did, on that quiet morning, the extent to which and the virulence of the administration's attempts to delegitimize inconvenient knowledge. It was perhaps prescient then that as one of the main topics to our discussion of the value of the AAUP, as it was then called, and its member presses was peer review, and how this distinguished us from other publishers and other disseminators of knowledge. One of the hottest debates of that day-long retreat was about whether to remove American from the organization's name, given that more and more of our member presses are based outside the US and North America. But what we discovered in the survey data that had been commissioned was that university presses in Europe and Asia, rather than resenting the use of the word American as imperial overreach, actually valued the inclusion of American because it signaled to their authors, their institutions, and their customers that the books published by member presses had been peer-reviewed and were therefore trustworthy and reliable. Peer review, which for those who aren't familiar, generally involves a manuscript being sent to 2 established scholars and experts in one or more aspects of the book project under review, is only part of the vetting process for university press books. It's a very important part, and we don't move forward with any book that we publish unless it has been not only peer-reviewed, but favorably peer-reviewed, sometimes going to the same 2 reviewers 2 or 3 times, sometimes going to up to 4 or 5 reviewers, to ensure that the work in question is accurate and speaks to an ongoing discourse. So, but more than our peer review process, first books, which are often based on dissertations, have already had their major arguments subjected to scrutiny by dissertation committees before they're submitted to a university press editor. Many university press books include chapters or parts thereof that have been published in peer-reviewed academic journals. And in some institutions, department will arrange to have their faculty's book manuscripts workshopped by external scholars, yet another layer of peer review. And then there's the role of the acquiring editor at the university press. While these editors may or may not be experts in the fields in which they acquire, over the years of seeing thousands of proposals and acquiring hundreds of books, they also develop a sense of for the reliability of a project's arguments and its source base. And more importantly, they know what questions to ask the author if they aren't sure. So even before a university press book goes to press, it has been vetted by several rounds of experts. In press, the role of the copy editors cannot be underestimated in the process of ensuring reliability either. While copy editors are charged with reviewing manuscripts for issues of style, many are also experts on the topics of the books they edit. And of course, once a book is published, there is a robust critical apparatus in the form of scholarly journals that subjects books to further scrutiny, identifying errors, questioning lines of argument, and holding flawed assumptions up to the light. All of these activities comprise what I call an ecosystem of reliability. I think less obvious, perhaps, is the role that university presses play in ensuring that reliable knowledge is also disseminated as widely and accurately as possible. Something that I spend a lot of time thinking about is metadata. the information about a book that allows it to be discovered, cataloged, and referenced. And I was reminded yet again of the importance of good metadata when, after reading Chris Wickham's Survey of the History of Medieval Europe, which was published by Yale University Press and struck me as being very reliable, I wanted to read more in depth about the history of medieval Germany. I went to Amazon, of course, and was surprised to find that the books that came up first was a reissue of a book originally published in 1896, and that the fourth result was a self-published book by a non-scholar whose publisher had simply paid for his book to be held up high in the rankings. I recognized these books for what they were, from the titles and from the authors, but I wondered how many readers would buy these books not realizing that they had not been peer-reviewed and that they neither represented the best nor the most up-to-date research. So ensuring that the ways that we describe and disseminate our books in this analysis is as important as ensuring the quality of what's in the book. And while we in the University Press community, however, have to make sure that we are not complacent about the books we publish and the process that safeguards the dependability of knowledge. Indeed, the ecosystem as a whole is fragile. The peer review process is also fragile. Sorry, I'm going to turn over. It can be gamed, obviously. Editors can pick favorable readers. We can spin the results in various ways if we want, so we should never be complacent that peer review alone is enough. Other than the concerns about peer review, though, is also the question about whose knowledge is considered reliable. And I think that's of increasing importance. So conscious or unconscious bias can affect the work that we as editors do. Not merely ethnic, racial, or gendered bias, but also biases about the reputation of a scholar's institution, where they got their PhD, where they're teaching now, and the sort of diversity of knowledge, and I think in that sense is really important too. Are we more likely to favor projects written by a UC Berkeley trained and Stanford-based scholar than we are by someone whose PhD is from a so-called second-tier program, or who may be an adjunct at a state college? For an acquisitions editor drowning in proposals, is it easier to say yes to a project based on an Ivy League dissertation? I mean, among the dozens of editors I've worked with now over 25 years, I've never seen such biases play out, and I think Cornell's list is proof that we're a publisher who seeks the very best scholarship, regardless of the reputation of the author's institution. But these questions remain critical and have to be, I think, at the forefront as we are making decisions as editors. Who gets to be an expert? Whose knowledge is considered reliable? And this is a question that the university press community needs to constantly interrogate. Happily, the AUP, and we ended up losing the American from American Association of University Presses, not because of anti-imperialism, but rather because we were being too often confused with the American Association of University Professors, and all our emails were going to them instead. But presses have started to address these concerns by promoting diversity of all kinds among university press staff, among the boards of series and series editors. And so having editors and other UP staff with a diversity of experiences will help ensure a diversity of knowledge that is genuinely reliable. And I think with that, I turn it over to Durba.
So I'll echo two things that have already been said. Charlie's comment that it's remarkable that we needed a faculty senate resolution reaffirming our commitment to reliable knowledge. And I'll also just say a word about elections. So the Indian elections are going on right now. A remarkable number of people will vote, and it will take many, many weeks. And I'm going to tell you why history is important, so stay with me. So I'll draw primarily from my experience as a historian who studies South Asia and who's employed at an American research institution. And my career has been spanned by the rise of the internet, which was intended to promise all kinds of democratic knowledge. Good, useful, reliable, and then some not so reliable. In terms of history, for South Asia, it turns out that in South Asia, everybody thinks they're a historian. And so there are thousands of websites, blogs, Wikipedia pages devoted to particular kinds of histories. One of the challenges for those of us who work in the academy has been engaging with that history, what we often call popular or amateur history, but also correcting it sometimes, which doesn't feel great if you're an academic. So I'll just say a word about what academic historians tend to do. So most readers of history presume that historical facts are relatively stable. We know something happened on such and such a date, somewhere with various consequences. I'm actually looking at Itzy Hall because I was just at a workshop that celebrated the anniversary of 1919, and Itzy said, was there somebody working on Germany there? And I said, I didn't know. So many things happened in 1919, and this is a sign that historians, we know we can't recount everything, that we have to be selective, we have to choose ideas, events, and usually we're doing more than telling a story. We're making an argument for why something turned out the way that it did. So for academic historians, the goal of writing a monograph and hopefully publishing it with a university press is to tell a story that hasn't been told, or to retell a story that we think we know pretty well. And so often what academic historical monographs do is make critical arguments that challenge received truths. And in order to do that, we have to meet a certain bar, and some of that is met by the review process. We have to have evidence, documents, materials, images, and probably any scholarship in any field now shows that the archive of historical work is pretty large. We need to show how our evidence demonstrates our arguments, and we also need to be able to show that our arguments stand up to the criticism of experts. And here's where the review process that Mahinder described is so important in the academic process, in the academic university process. I want to make the case that university presses produce books that are different than those books that are on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Those are all very, very good books, and I would encourage anyone to buy and read books. But I do want to make the case that university presses, particularly the one like Cornell with its long tradition, are central to the core public mission of informing a broader public through the kind of deep research that takes place usually only in universities. I'll just tell you a story. So I've written 2 books with Cambridge University Press. Both of them have been made into movies. I didn't make any money out of it. Other people did, and those are people that need to make a living by selling their books. And so they had to make different arguments than I had to. So luckily I have a day job and I don't need to sell books, right? And in fact, my publisher will tell you that I don't sell very many books. As a historian of India, I can tell you that Indians are obsessed with history. People read and actively debate history in India. And one of the things that's most important about this history is that people in India will often say that professional or foreign academics don't take their history seriously, which is why Indians need to be able to write their story. This obsession with history is, in some ways, I would argue, central to the fact that India is a post-colonial state that felt that it didn't have a history that wasn't colonial until 1947. And so in India, people feel very, very strongly that telling the history of the nation is a way to consolidate the nation. That's not usually the thing that academic historians are doing. Usually we're challenging these national narratives. In the first 2 decades of India's independence, writing history was perceived to be central to creating the new nation state, and there are thousands of state-sponsored projects that accumulated and generated new archives. However, in spite of that early role for historians and archivists and librarians, historians and scholars in India have suffered from a lack of scholarly infrastructure. I think it's so important that the university librarian is the one that oversees the university press here. I think it's a real commitment to reliable knowledge. In India, archives, libraries, universities are massively underfunded, particularly in the humanities. And one of the things I would say about India, you probably have heard about various levels of the rise of xenophobic violence. You probably also know that the post-colonial Indian government committed enormous resources to creating a generation of STEM scholars who could build nuclear arms for India, ignoring the humanities. And there have been various arguments made that the consequences of ignoring the humanities are the state that India is in today. In the popular and populist accounts generated by amateur historians, India's male leaders were Hindu, they were upper caste, they should be revered, and their right to govern has been established by a kind of divine right that's enshrined by caste and gender. If you are following the elections, you know that these histories are rife everywhere as an explanation for why you should vote for one political party over another. Wendy Doniger, who's a very well-known Sanskritist from the University of Chicago, her book was banned It was called An Alternative History of the Hindus. Jim Lane, a very little known but lovely religious studies scholar who teaches at Macalester, has been banned from returning to India because of his biography of Shivaji. As a result, academic historians in India have been put on the defensive. Just 2 years ago, a provincial government attempted to get rid of tourist materials that identified the Taj Mahal as an important national site. Why? Because it was built by a Muslim emperor. These were claims that were pushed on by amateur historians and scholars and blogs and so on. And so it calls into question, obviously, well, it doesn't call into question, it demands reliable knowledge, but it's hard to know how we establish that reliable knowledge in a place that doesn't have university presses. A big part of this problem, I would argue, is that Indian universities do not have the tradition of university presses that Mahinder described for the United States or for the UK. The two biggest university presses that operate in India are Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press. And those are considered colonial holdovers. And in some ways, they're considered, even though reliable for me to get tenure, they are not considered very reliable in India. And I'll just tell you that when I go to India, people say that's fine that you teach Indian history in this other institution, but that's not really the history that we know about. The kind of trust that citizens typically have in the university and in the knowledge that is produced by universities is increasingly seen to be suspect. I think this is the case in India, and I'm concerned, obviously, that it's increasingly becoming the case here in the United States. I want to end on a happy note, though. The longevity of this university and this press is surely something we can all support, and I think it's crucial to the success, not only of generating reliable knowledge, but a robust democracy.
My name is Peter Enns. As Charlie mentioned, I'm a professor in the government department and director of the Roper Center. I'm honored to be part of this event tonight in recognition of Cornell University Press's 150th year. I'll share a quick thought on the value of university presses, and what I want to do is also offer a brief idea for how university presses might further support the creation of reliable knowledge. And my comments will echo a bit of what Mahinder said and Durba, what they said, but also from a slightly different angle, I think. Many people, at least many faculty, would argue that academic tenure is necessary for creating reliable knowledge. I would like to suggest that university presses hold a complementary and critically important role in producing this knowledge. Tenure, as many people in the room know, means an indefinite academic appointment that can be terminated only for cause or under extraordinary circumstances. The principal purpose of tenure is to safeguard academic freedom, which is necessary for teaching and conducting research. If faculty members can lose their positions because of their speech or research findings, they cannot fulfill their core responsibilities to advance and transmit knowledge. This model depends, however, on being able to publish research in venues that value and promote academic freedom and rigorous research. Of course, researchers have many publication options: academic journal articles, op-eds, issue briefs, blogs, but a large amount of research is best suited as a monograph or a book. University presses offer a necessary and ideal publishing venue. These presses incorporate expert and peer review, as Mahinder described, into the selection process, and they publish and promote research on important but potentially lesser known or underappreciated topics, or as Durba described, different perspectives that may currently dominate. And these, as we just heard, are often important topics or perspectives that other presses might overlook. And one of the reasons is often focus on immediate sales. The university press model ensures that research protected by tenure has an outlet for publication and a mechanism to transmit this knowledge to relevant audiences, such as scholars, students, and interested citizens. This is not to say that book sales do not or should not matter in university press decisions. Sales can provide positive incentives that support reliable knowledge, such as writing clearly, highlighting the relevance of academic topics, and marketing books to broader audiences. But sales can also provide negative incentives, such as privileging popularity instead of the importance of the topic, or prioritizing overly simplistic accounts instead of reliable and rigorous knowledge. Without university presses, I suspect the research tenured professors conduct would be less rigorous, less reliable, and less innovative. For these reasons, it is critical that universities like Cornell continue to provide and hopefully increase the resources they provide to their presses. Now I'd like to shift a little bit and suggest one way I think university presses can further support the creation of reliable knowledge. And although I've published a book with Cambridge University Press and another book with the Russell Sage Foundation, most of my publications come from journal articles, and so this is slightly informed by that perspective. Because in the social sciences, many academic journals now require the data used for the article to be made publicly available prior to publication, so results can be replicated in the future. Now, often the research data are numbers, but not always. Data can be interviews, archival materials, or other sources. Now, I'm not sure if university presses are ready to require that the data be made available prior to publication, but they can certainly encourage this, and they can also provide a platform. For example, quantitative data could be hosted on the press's website, but perhaps even more interesting, anonymized interview text or digital images of archival materials could be hosted on the University Press website. This would make the research process more transparent and hopefully draw additional attention to the book. This is just one possible idea to consider. Cornell University Press is a leader in innovation, so I expect that it will continue to be at the forefront of finding ways to further promote reliable knowledge. So on that note, as we celebrate 150 years, congratulations to all the people at Cornell University Press, and thanks for the work you do to support the creation of reliable knowledge.
Thank you guys. So, and happy 150th. So let me say, when we had our meeting, we actually met to figure out what we thought about these topics. And when we had our meeting, I found myself going down a kind of bizarre rabbit hole that began with thinking about how often I'm wanting to teach journalistic writings about a topic in class because of the way they tell the story. And a lot of journalists these days are really doing a lot of research, but they're not publishing with academic presses. Anyway, so I'm not going to take you down that same rabbit hole, but I am tasked with talking about, or given the opportunity, to talk some about the difference between reliable knowledge, maybe slash usable knowledge, or versus usable knowledge. See the rabbit hole. So the way that I'm going to do it is a story that you may actually know. It's a story about a woman named Phyllis Wheatley. You may already know this, but it's a story that, and the reason that I'm telling it is because for me, with the usable knowledge part, I literally think this story when I'm writing a proposal for a university press. So I'm sort of sharing it. All right, anyway, sometime in the fall of 1772, an enslaved woman in Boston named Phyllis Wheatley found herself meeting with 18 of the most influential thinkers and politicians in the Massachusetts colony. Her owner, John Wheatley, had assembled the group to determine if Phyllis was indeed the author of the poem she had been publishing during the previous few years. The assemblage was necessary to authenticate her writing, to prove to the public that the poems she had been publishing since she was 15 were in fact hers, and that the public could trust what she was writing. Without this assurance, Wheatley would be unable to elicit the number of book orders the printers in those days required. Her livelihood depended on it, And because her master had promised her freedom if she earned a certain sum through her writing, her freedom depended on the outcome too. John Wheatley assembled an illustrious group of interrogators, hoping that their stature would support Phyllis's claim of authorship and that the opinion and book purchases by the general public would follow. We don't actually know much about the questions that were asked during the 3-hour meeting with the 18 men, but we know who was there. The group included men like Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, Andrew Oliver, the colony's lieutenant governor, and John Hancock, among others. Whatever the nature of the exam, she passed it and earned the letter of support that she and her master had hoped for. I'm nerding out here, so I'm gonna quote what they said. "We whose names are underwritten do assure the world, capital W, that the poems, capital P, specified in this following page were, as we verily believe, written by Phyllis, a young Negro girl who was but a few years since brought an uncultivated barbarian from Africa, and has ever since been, and now is, under the disadvantage, capital D, of serving as a slave in a family in this town. She's been examined by some of the best judges, capital J, nerding out. That is why I'm telling you about the capitalization here, and is thought qualified to have written them," end quote. Her next book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, written by, this is the whole title, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, written by Phyllis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston, end quote, was published in September 1773. Ultimately, Wheatley's book was widely reviewed and discussed in England and in America, where it became available in 1774. Voltaire wrote to a correspondent that Phyllis Wheatley had, quote, proved blacks could write poetry and were probably more human than he had previously thought, end quote. So with Wheatley's story as a backdrop, a story I literally do think of when I'm crafting proposals to share with university presses, when I think about the vital role universities play in producing and ensuring that such a thing as reliable knowledge exists, I have more questions than answers. Only 3. 1, what are the consequences for citizenship and democracy of our so regularly relying on the most privileged and well-connected to have almost sole discretion as to what information is even considered reliable? 2, how easily or quickly do we create new knowledge or knowledge that challenges the status quo when gatekeepers tend to valorize what has come before, valorize what they know, think about what they value? And 3, is a system designed to create reliable knowledge the same system we need to create knowledge that is useful, popular, or about freedom? Thank you.
Truth might fracture. It was a horrifying line to hear. I'll start a little depressing, but I guarantee I'll be a little bit lighter at the end. Right after the last presidential election in the United States, I gathered together the executive directors. We get together so often in the Boston, in the San Francisco area. Wikipedia, Internet Archive, Electronic Frontier Foundation, Mozilla, Freedom of the Press Foundation. Basically, we get together for dinner, and it was basically one of those, what do we do now? What do we do now? And how guilty are we, the collected people at this dinner, for what happened? In terms of fake news, about active distortions, about misleading the public, about basically having people that have turned to the web and basically been betrayed. And what do we do now? The horrifying line from me was Catherine Maher, the exec director of Wikipedia. She said, truth might fracture. So what does this mean? She said, Wikipedia is based on the idea that truth, or on some concept, Martin Luther King or whatever, will stabilize. It will reach some level, there might be debates, but it won't fracture. So how does this happen? She said, knowledge integrity. And I said, what's the issue? Or how does this, what goes on in this? She said, citations. What happens in Wikipedia the debates are basically around citation wars. Of what can you cite to go and build your argument towards how an article or a concept should change and be swayed. And I said, okay, what can we do? And she said, make better citations more available. Wikipedia biases towards things you can click on. They want to basically make it so you can click and see things out there in the net. So I said, at that time, I'm doubling down. The Internet Archive's full in. Wikipedia is the number 5 website of all, where the Internet Archive is number 300. Okay, I'm a little envious, but it does mean that there's 100 million less popular than we are, but they're number 5. So I said, okay, we'll put the 20th century online. And so the EFF, the head of EFF, the ACLU of the digital world, turned a little white, and she said, really? And I said, yes, we're going to put the 20th century online. Because if you look at what is out there and the Internet Archive's digitized materials, it goes, and by decade, it goes up to 1923 and then craters, and books by decade, and it goes almost silent through the 20th century. Then it's back up at the end of the 20th century, and then the 21st century. You say, oh, okay, well, you know, obviously nobody published anything during the 20th century. Well, that's not true. Then it's like, oh, well, maybe all that's in print and you can just go and buy it. Well, let's go to Amazon. So Amazon study of by decade, it goes way up by 1923, craters. And the 20th century is almost missing from Amazon.com. If it's anywhere, it's in universities. But it's not available to a generation that is turning to the web to answer questions, which is, frankly, well, all of us, and pretty much everybody. So the idea is to try to fix the frickin' web. We had been archiving all of the URLs, outbound links from Wikipedia, and we finally fought through their communities to go and robotically go and fix the links. And we fixed over 10 million links now. So of the links because links break. So we fixed 10 million links to make it so that if you can get there, you can at least see what it is that was the original author's idea and it's not broken anymore. And we're now the most destination beyond Wikipedia by a factor of 3 of the next most popular place people go from Wikipedia. The next most popular place they go is Google Books. And the next beyond that is journal literature, DOI.org. That's our agenda. Let's fix those. If you click through those, you end up with endless paywalls and snippets and, you know, crap or ISBNs that go nowhere or, you know, sort of, hey, you should just go to your library. It's like, no, this is not good enough, right? This is not how it is we're going to educate a population. So we started working away at this. And we have a little prototype here on Martin Luther King's. If you go down to the references at the end, blah, 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 it's very long. And this is just one of the pages. Gosh, this is a long article. Get out of the citations at the end. This one has a page number. And what we want, and what we've done in this set of circumstances, you open right to the page. Boom. Right. You want more? You get more, right? If you go and click, you know, maybe you only get a page or 2, right, before you get to a preview, and that's all you get, and then you have to log in and borrow the book. And then that's limited because of copyright stuff, such that it's only one reader at a time. But it turns out that one page, or sort of getting a little bit deeper, is often what a reader wants. And not only does what a reader wants, is what Wikipedia wants to be able to compute, go and find whether that reference is a good reference for what's being asserted on the page using computer matching to go and find out, can we go and prove out Wikipedia's assertions based on the work that's a sort of white papers they have on knowledge integrity. Then they want to go and be able to go and use those assertions and compare it against the global literature to find out, is that a radical assertion? Is that a radical author? Is it, and maybe that's okay, but let's go and find the ones that are outside of the norm so they can be brought up to human editors. This is what Wikipedia wants, and this is what we were trying to achieve. So we basically went flat at it and basically took all the ISBNs out of Wikipedia and just started prioritizing those and digitizing those at 1,000 a day. And we're basically trying to go through and put this up. And we were looking for support from publishers. And MIT Press said yes, they would be up for this digitize and lend format shifting, still limited use, but digitizing and making available in computer readable ways their texts, such that limited access, this controlled digital lending, and it's great. And they started asking their authors and going through this process, and it was, hooray for MIT Press, but it was slow. You know who wasn't slow? Cornell University Press. Cornell University Press, under the leadership of Dean and his boss, Gerald Beasley, said, let's do the whole damn thing. Let's do the damn thing now. We could go and dig around in our vaults, I think some cave somewhere, and it's like, okay, but I said, I've got other libraries. If you give the okay, they'll go and source the books. And the University of Toronto was completely up for it. And I'm happy to say that as of today, there are, oops, ding, 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 the big reveal. Cornell University Press, 3,053 of the titles are now up on the internet for controlled digital lending. And it's just phenomenal. It's more than everybody else has been doing, and most of them kind of look a little like library books. But they also have awesome covers if we go and pick the right ones. And so these are now available, and Cornell University Press is, I think, showing the light not only towards doing great scholarly work, going and doing peer review, which is all very important, but getting it out there, and getting it out there in a right balance. So yeah, we're still trying to protect the press and make money so it doesn't get yelled at and doesn't get shut down or whatever, right? So we still want to go and make that all happen, but we have to get it to people that are looking for answers. And Cornell University Press is leading the way in this way. And I just want to say thank you, and I'm proud to be working with the Cornell University Press. Thank you.
Okay, what a great sequence of presentations, and now let's have some questions from the audience. Back, yep.
Hi, my name is Emma Farquharson. I'm a PhD candidate in Dr. Nugent's lab. Don't worry, he didn't force me to be here. I was just wondering, the Wikipedia update that you just spoke of is amazing. I'm 26. My generation was told not to use Wikipedia, to look things up, and then to go to the mercy of the wide web. How would you suggest, it does a great job with this university and universities that are interested, how would you suggest spreading the word on my end? My whole family, for example, none of them are in STEM, so none of them know where to look, none of them know what's a reliable source. How would we, like you said, it's needed now. How do we make it now for more people, the people that are outnumbering those who have knowledge of this, of being able to click the references and go to this book now? And
Oh, I think people, I've been quite impressed with end users. They're going to use Google and Wikipedia. They're not going to go and use some random ProQuest something or other in the middle of, that you can't get to anyway. Right? They're going to use what's easy. And so let's fix what's easy to use to be better, would be the suggestion. And make it possible and easy to go beyond, right? Yes, growing up in the old days, if you just used the encyclopedia for your research, you would get a D at best. But it's a good launching place. It's a good place to start. So let's make it so that they don't have to end at Wikipedia. Let's turn all of the footnotes blue. And let's not just stop with Wikipedia. Wikipedia is just an easy way to view it. We have the possibility now of taking all the PDF viewers. Most of us read our PDFs in browser plugin-based PDF viewers. Why don't we go and turn all of the footnotes on those blue? Why don't we recognize the footnotes? And a footnote is just a latent hypertext link. Let's just go and make it so that we've actually built that docuverse, that global brain that was promised so long ago. I think Ted Nelson was right. I mean, it's a good idea. Memex was right. Tim Berners-Lee was right. We just didn't build it. Right? And we are the establishment. We are the establishment. There's not going to be somebody else that builds it. It's going to be us. And the great thing is the technology is available to us. And with things like Cornell University Press showing some leadership towards not just suing everybody and their brother based on people reading their books, that's a good thing. All right, and so I think we have a role to play in academia, not only just for great production of materials, but for better dissemination of these materials. The good news is people are looking for it. I mean, the Internet Archive is full of old stuff, but we're the 300th most popular website. There's 3 million people that come to the Internet Archive. We see what they do. They want the information. Often it's just not there. They're stuck with stuff that's pre-1923, and it's just not good enough.
Thank you.
Yes.
I am Anna Bartel. I'm with Engaged Cornell. I just wanted to call out that the 3 Cornell faculty up here are all practitioners of public scholarship and community engaged teaching. And when people ask me what I do, I say, well, my life's work is making higher education more useful in the world. And so Noliwe, I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about what you mean by useful knowledge.
My students will tell you I have a hard time answering questions without telling stories. So the little story that goes along with that would be, really, I think I thought all academic knowledge was useful because I'm an academic, right? I get off on listening to people in areas, if they're mine or not. I believe that there's a save the world kind of thing, knowledge will set you free kind of thing. So, but my third book, unintentionally, I ended up writing a book that was far more popular outside of academic than in it. It was with Beacon Press, which is a sort of, I mean, they publish a lot of academic people, but they're not a university press. But I still thought I was writing an academic book. And then the whole it got in front of people who were not. And for the first time, book number 3, I literally had people like coming up to me and saying, thank you for writing this. Not students, but you know, thank you for even having footnotes for stuff that we thought we knew about, but didn't know that you could literally go and read things, that there were archives that you know, we didn't know because we don't read. We don't get many academics coming to talk to us in these parts. And what that did is means that my 4th book is also like all written for like most of the people I talk to. I talk in church basements. I talk in schools. I'm talking to little groups of people and nobody ever heard of book clubs, right? When people feel that what you have written, you have made it accessible to them and topical in a way that they can see how it's changing their lives right then, or how what's in it is the basis for them thinking about how to think themselves free, how to join with other people. And again, I stumbled into it. It was not that I set out to if I'd said I'm going to expand my base and been like, yes, I'm going to get more Twitter followers or something, it probably wouldn't have worked. It just so happened that it became useful to people outside of academia. So I think all academic knowledge is useful to people, right? That I had people thanking me for writing it. Yeah, it was just different. So that's my little idiosyncratic reason for thinking like, is it just because we like it? What happens if it gets out in the world without the translation? Like we'll often say, you know, students, if they were thinking clearly, they'd be going back to Carthage if they want to understand inequality or whatever, right? Like, you know, we have lots of things that can get you there. They don't have the base, or people outside of these spaces, or who go to crappy K through 12 schools, or live in neighborhoods that are falling down, they don't get the relationship between ancient Greece and inequality in their neighborhood, right? Like, so it is a different kind of useful when you start talking about things that are impacting them, that they know are impacting them. So yeah, for me.
I have a sort of celebrity story from the history of the press that talks about useful knowledge as well. Our editor, Roger Hayden, acquired a book on humanitarian rights and a critique of sort of humanitarian organizations. And it's done really well. It's one of our best-selling books. I think we sold 20, 30,000 copies. It sells into course adoption. But the picture he has on his door, I think he still has it there, is a picture from People magazine. And it is Angelina Jolie getting off a plane. And you can clearly see her holding this book. And she was going on a humanitarian mission, and, you know, for all we think about celebrities, I mean, she actually has done a lot of good for. But the fact that she was willing to, you know, she was reading this book, clearly reading this book on the plane, landing in whichever humanitarian place she was going to, and the fact that it was a critique of the kind of work that she was endorsing, I think is just a really cool way of thinking about that, too. And that, you know, so, yeah. I don't know if it sold any more books, but it's really cool to see,
A question for Durba Ghosh, but I think it's kind of addressed a lot of issues here. And that's the question of reliable knowledge and peer review when it comes to, on the one hand, the proliferation of popular histories in India, and there'd be other examples in the United States as well. And your point, Noliwe, saying, well, there's also this other side of reliable knowledge that's protected by tradition, by privilege, generally white men, and this tension between the two. That on the one hand, you want peer review, and you want the confer of authority to consider reliable knowledge. But on the other hand, that also keeps other knowledges out of what is considered reliable knowledge. Just thoughts from you two, but all of you, as to how presses adjudicate precisely that process today would be interesting to hear about.
I mean, I can say a word. I was very moved by Noliwe's remarks, and I think Noliwe's spot on, right? That universities and university presses have often had a gatekeeping function, right? And that peer review is maybe a fancier way of saying that. I do think, and I would only think about the stuff. There are many, many books churned out and printed in India, some of which are working toward imagining a different kind of liberation, as Noliwe said, and others which really are trying to constrain other people, right? And so for me as a historian, I think it's very important that it's usable, as Anna said, and that we think very actively about history being factual, but also that it enables this thing that we call the nation state to function in its best form, right, in an inclusive and diverse way, right? So, I mean, one of the things that I think is important for India in particular is that, and it's probably true for all nation states, including this one, is one of the things nation states are obliged to do is protect their minorities, right, is to defend minority rights. And often popular histories tend not to do that, right? Tend to be telling a story that's comfortable or easy or reaffirming, right? And so I would only claim the space of being critical as the important space of what I think we should be doing. And I think in that sense, Phyllis Wheatley does fulfill that, right? That it's a very, very critical text that unsettles certain kinds of truths, and obviously it didn't come out of the university press, so.
It was pre-university.
Pre-university.
despite what Harvard says.
Yeah.
I would think. You sure?
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
talk after you.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to add that I do think there's a tension there between the potential of gatekeeping and the reliability. And to me, the most critical component, at least at a starting point, is recognizing and remembering the tension. And it actually sort of, my thoughts were evolving through the course of the panel, and then to hear, at least as I understood it, that this Wikipedia algorithm it's based on citation, so you have a frequency problem. If you have if most of the books aren't sort of reliable, however we want to collectively define that, you could still have the links to them, right? So the algorithm isn't guaranteed to work if it's based on a frequency parameter. And so that to me suggests there has to be some decisions about what's reliable and not. But as soon as we get to, well, who's making those decisions, we're back to biases, implicit or explicit, can creep in. And so remembering that tension and making sure our conversations keep that as a key area of focus, I think is a critical element. But that's as far as I've gotten. So that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a difference. One of the things I learned at our lunch, that Cornell is a tenure press.
Yeah.
So there's a handful of, what'd you say, like 20?
Just one. But
Yeah, but just possibly 19 inferior versions that are almost guaranteed. Like if they pick you up and if they publish your book, you're pretty well situated when your file goes out to other people in the field to get tenure. I was first of all just surprised to hear the small number, right? Like it's a relatively small number for the number that are guaranteed kind of tenure. But the way that I would interpret the question has more to do with knowledge inside of the academy and out. Like what you need the university press for is to give you that imprint because you're trying to get tenure. Right? Like that's what's really keeping them afloat. And as you said, and then in Europe, they're kind of like, well, we can rely on this, so it means something different because you have outside reviewers. Your hierarchy works for us. We can glom onto it. And so in a rigid hierarchy that is the academy, you do in fact need someone who you believe stand on. But that, and again, rabbit hole, right? But that, I would say, really does have something to do with some of the diversity tensions in the larger university. If you are constantly, the way that my kid got educated in Princeton, New Jersey, and then in a private school, and then at Amherst, makes him completely legible to certain kinds of people. With him, without code switching, without thinking about it, it is the kind of classic, rigorous education that is not how I got educated. Like I had a completely different education. I had to train myself to be legible to people. I tend to be plain spoken. I had a whole different way of presenting myself. I think that's what university, like that's the tension to me. It's you are continuing a hierarchy that of necessity, given the stratifications worldwide, is privileging certain kinds of people. But we like it like that in the academy. I mean, that's the whole point. You know, in a way, that's how you become an expert. You get to be a professor because you know more about stuff than other people. Like, it's really not supposed to be you just sort of wandering off the street and, you know, I am as qualified as you to teach whatever it is. You have to be trained
just
up.
wander in office.
Yeah. So I think that's the difference if you're talking, like, and that's the Phyllis Wheatley kind of dynamic, which she needed that for, had very practical. She needed this thing because she needed money, she needed to buy her freedom, she needed to support herself. She wasn't trying to assume a position amongst that class of people. That would be a whole different thing, right? And I think we're still seeing some of that.
The Phyllis Wheatley story is interesting because, of course, it wasn't peer reviewed. Those weren't her peers who were reviewing her work. And it would be, so, and that leads, so one of the things that we started a new imprint a few years ago called Three Hills, and it's supposed to be our trade sort of regional New York imprint, but in publishing books under that imprint, we didn't want to lessen our standards. But we also realized that popular history of New York State, sending it to academic historians was not, in fact, going to result in the kind of, so what we've had to do is redefine what peer means, basically. And so under that imprint in particular, the editor who's responsible for that is really trying to find interesting people who are not necessarily, or often frequently not academics, but who are qualified because of various other life experiences to review the works that he's sending them. So we have this, a novel that's sort of in the works, and it's part of it is about 9/11, and the character is a firefighter. And so we actually sent it to a firefighter And we're like, how accurate is this? Like a fire chief, like how accurate is the language? How accurate is this description? Which is, not something that we would do for a lot of other things. And in fact, he came back, he's like, no, I don't, you should really spend a little more time, but or for books that have like really local histories, we're going to like local newspaper columnists to say, did they get the local story right? Is the flavor, so I think we I tend to do this as well. Peer review is like one peer review. But sort of separating that and thinking, well, who is a peer and what is the purpose of the review is something that I think we also, I would love to, just because of this, I'd love to subject some of the books I'm bringing in to non-academic review, just to get a sense of like, how does this, not necessarily, someone off the street, but someone who may not be trained in academics, but may have something really interesting to say about the content of the book, so.
Laura.
Thank you, Charlie. Laura Brown English. This has been terrific, and it's really exciting for me to hear this lively debate about the nature of reliability. I wonder if you're willing to comment. So your account of the problematic nature of reliability so far has been, I think, political, social, cultural. What about in relationship to knowledge creation? In the sense, I feel like there's a tension between reliability and innovation. And in our decade or in the next few decades, innovation seems to be headed in the direction of interdisciplinarity. So is that a thing in your engagement with reliability? And how do you manage the significant shifts in what we understand to be expertise in relationship to knowledge creation when we see the ground shifting in relationship to the interdisciplinary projects that it's so hard to identify the basis for discovering expertise in relationship to them. So I'm just wanting you to continue a little further on this kind of topic.
Yeah, I mean, from the publisher standpoint, I think, publishers can be culturally sort of conservative organizations. We tend to follow things that this worked well in the past, the 100, there's the British Museum published the history of the world in 100 objects. And then within about 3 years, I go to the Frankfurt Book Fair every year. Every year I went, you'd see more and more books, the history of this in 50 objects, the history of that. So there's a certain this works, so we will continue to flog it until it stops working anymore. But I do think that university presses in particular, unevenly perhaps, but are also leaders in pioneering new areas of knowledge. Whether it's in publishing critical theory in the 80s that Cornell did a lot of. And I think when I'm looking at a new series to go into or a new field, one of the questions we have is, but who will review it? And interdisciplinary works are really tricky too, because who do you find that the peer review question becomes really to the forefront? Who do you find who can speak to the entirety of the book, or do you find 3 or 4 reviewers who can speak to different parts of it? And then the sort of fragmented nature of the reports makes it hard to judge whether the book's any good or not, because you've got, the historian says, well, if only they played it more of the history, and the anthropologist says, oh, they know nothing about, and so, yeah, that's a really interesting question. It does, I think a number of publishers are probably hesitant to enter, and yet I think if you look at the lists of a lot of university presses around the world that have really staked a position and said, we're going to invent this new field, or the editor has been following this field pretty closely, and really even before the field is coalesced, they're like, I want to publish the first edited volume. And the editor who did that sort of was, just was the right place, right time, and said, this is something that's important. That could not have worked out. It could have been totally rejected by a whole bunch of people. So. But I think, again, as a publisher, I feel that weight. And that's why I'm not getting back to anyone about their proposals, is because I'm weighted down by ethical dilemmas all the time. But it is, I think that's a really good question. It's something that we really have to keep thinking of. But I think one of the, I did another AEP thing about how editors get in and out of series. But I think series are one way, in fact, to find new areas of knowledge, because you can get a series editor or a couple of series editors who are on the cutting edge, and they can actually help guide a press and say, these are really the scholars, and we're going to create or help create a field or a way of talking about a field, by the way. Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. So yeah, we've just started a new military history list, but at Cornell, and military history has this. My colleague Emily Andrews started this. And military history has this reputation in history and social history, and yet the field that the books she's bringing in and the kind of reviewer she's having to find to review the sort of sexual economy of war or objects of war and how sort of material culture of the Red Army, finding the reviewers who are going to be able to speak to that with and yet not alienate the military history audience, which they buy a lot of books, which is really nice. And so yeah, it's always a delicate balancing act.
I would say I think that the issue with interdisciplinarity is one of bibliography. Like people in different fields are familiar with particular scholarship, and so they're looking at your bibliography, just doing a fast skim, like, are the things that I think from my field, are they represented here? Not even the level of argument as much as just what are you building your argument on? But it is not always the case. Like you can consider yourself interdisciplinary and be primarily knowledgeable about history or primarily knowledgeable about literary stuff. But you're sort of mixing in other things. If you are literally colliding works and you're sending it out to one or two people who don't stretch that far. So it's kind of like, well, there's all these other fields. There's this sociology in the middle of this lit book. What is this? All of a sudden, we're talking psychology. I thought this was history. Where have you gone? I'm speaking personally. I learned this in grad school. No, I mean, all of my fields. So I'm in AFAM, American Studies, and women's feminist. Like all of my fields, right, are disciplinary free. And my work literally moves between knowledge created by scholars in other fields because it's thematic. And so I'm building the arguments that I need to based on the scholarship that exists from different fields. So I would always hear, I figured out how to do it now, but I would always hear, as a graduate student, we don't get her bibliography. The argument is fine. What are we supposed to do with this? And I would get turned down for things. And I hear from younger scholars who are literally trying to put things that may not be, like when they put things like that, they're still hearing, we kind of like this far, and we recognize this. I just don't know anything about 2/3 of the sources that are in, and so that's still, but then you just learn what press is descended to.
Yeah, we actually discussed a project. So we, at the press, projects come to what we call pre-board before it goes to the faculty board. And we sort of comment on everyone's project and we say, yeah, this seems like the faculty board will like this, or oh, you might want to send, put a different, don't use this introduction. We've got a few faculty board members here. Exactly.
Yeah.
But look, this is not one of my projects that we're going to be bringing to the next faculty board. But it was a book by a political scientist of Pakistani origin who's become totally disaffected by political science and political economy. And so her book started off 20 years ago as a political economy of Russian suitcase traders and prostitutes in Istanbul, but the political economy wasn't explaining it, so she went into psychohistory. And so it became this sort of psychohistory of two groups of people who are from failed empires and how they relate to each other or don't relate to each other. And so the two reviewers were both sort of from gender studies, but one was Turkish. I mean, it's a really interesting trail that sort of talks to both all of these questions, like how do you make that coherent? And so I think at our board, we're like, let's see what the faculty board thinks. We think it's kind of cool, but it's hard to, so it's going to be a really interesting, and so it turns out to be a sort of political economy, psychohistory, gender studies, Slavic, kind of, we'll see, I don't know, it's kind of...
I'd like to, so you're talking about sort of the evolution of scholarly work product, and it's going interdisciplinary. I think, let me take that as a springboard towards thinking a little bit bigger in terms of some of the evolution of scholarly work product that's possible towards being promoted in the age of the internet. So there's been a lot of monographs, but then it moved a lot more towards journals, then even preprints and conference proceedings, data sets, a website as the scholarly work product. How do we go and archive that? How do we go and promote that? What is Archive of the Next? Another major victory for Cornell in terms of really helping the scholarly record move forward and move in very different directions that weren't in the classic lines of the press. I was on the advisory board of MIT Press for a while and it was frustrating as hell. because they didn't want to move out of what it is they're doing. There's all this great stuff being done at MIT, and they didn't, they weren't the one that made OpenCourseWare. They weren't. So why not? Why didn't they? So if there's an evolution possible of really expanding the idea of what scholarly work product should be made available and what the context should be such that it's people will understand what stage it's in, I'd suggest the answer to a bad speech is more context, as opposed to just shut it down, don't allow it out because it's not quite ready yet. It's going to get out, it's getting out all the time, and it's part of the discussion. How do we evolve academia, like an Ivy League like Cornell in general? What does the role of MIT Press play for the next 150 years? Is it going to be, something that can be reduced to a PDF? I don't think so. It's going to be something pretty different and exciting, or not relevant, or not very relevant, or just sort of a milestone of, yes, this fact is true because it was peer-reviewed enough. I think that the scholarly work product that we can look at is a very broad range thing, and it may be something that individual professors go do, graduate students do, departments do, the press does, the library does, and that's what I find extremely exciting, and not enough is really being done towards leveraging the smarts that is in Ithaca, New York, and the other, I know that you publish from place, all over the place, but just if you think of it sort of as a microcosm of academia in general, what's the evolution of scholarly work product? How do we support it? How do we make it permanent? How do we make it referenceable? How do we make it reusable in different forms? Yes, it will be interdisciplinary, but it will also have a time axis. As it matures along and becomes discredited, how do we go and surface the discrediting through people's exploration of seeing something that's already antique? That's the thing I'd love to see out of the discussion of when you're contemplating the next 150 years of Cornell University Press.
We're kind of at the end of the panel discussion. We're going to have a great reception around the corner, and hopefully you can engage the panel there. I'm sorry to have to cut this off. So before we go around the corner, let's thank the great panel for all they did.